Okay, the game is a strategy and tactics game, Manila 1945. This is from 2007, so fairly recent in the strategy and tactics run. As you can see in the rules there, they identify it as the Stalingrad of the Pacific. I don't know that I agree with that assessment necessarily, although it's not like I'm an expert on what the fighting was like in Manila in 1945, because I know absolutely nothing about this battle. As far as I knew, in World War II, there was never any intense urban combat in Manila. I thought we just took the Philippines back from the Japanese, with MacArthur marching ashore saying, "I've returned." And, there was no Japanese really left there. We just took it back because they had withdrawn closer to the home islands. But no, apparently there was some quite intense and costly, particularly to the Filipinos, fighting around Manila, in and around Manila, in 1945. As you can see here, the map is pretty much already set up. The game starts with essentially a free setup, and if this was an opposed game, these Japanese counters would be flipped over to their fog of war side, which is the rising suns. Now, if I were the Japanese player, I have no idea how I'd remember what I put where if these were all flipped over to the little rising sun flags, but that's what you're supposed to do to indicate fog of war for the American player. And as you can see here, knowing nothing about the battle, I mean, I read the articles in the magazine, which were really quite good. Strategy and tactics, despite the fact that it, in recent years, it looks a little bit better, but despite the fact that the fonts and layout and everything, the look and production feel of the magazine is something very much like, from the early 80s, in terms of just the sophistication of their ads and things like that. The articles that I've read in Strategy and Tactics, and I've got, maybe 7 or 8 issues of this over the years, are generally pretty good. The quality is pretty good. The quality of writing is pretty good. And so the articles about the action in Manila in 1945 were pretty good, I thought. So I did learn a little bit about how, the disposition of forces, about how the battle went, how things turned out ultimately for each side. And as you can see by looking at the map, there's kind of open space, and then there's these urban spaces, which are these gray areas representing the actual city. And you can see here there's a couple of airfields too, which are noted on the map, and then down here there's a Fort McKinley, which has some urban area around it, but is otherwise kind of on a raised plateau. What happened historically was, I guess, the Japanese forces were much more spread out than what you can see that I've set them up on the map. I did try and do a bit of an historical setup, because apparently the Japanese at the time were dispersed all over these different areas of the city because they thought they could hold the entire city. Once the American forces moved in, that assessment rapidly changed. And what happened is the Americans kind of rolled up all the Japanese resistance in these outer boroughs, and the Japanese sort of did an Alamo stand here at the Intramuros, which is this kind of fortified, historical walled city in the center of Manila. And as you can see there, I've put a lot of their anti-aircraft and artillery forces that all have like ranged and indirect fire capabilities in the interior of the city there. That kind of made sense to me. But I didn't want to do, if you're going to game this system, I don't know why you wouldn't just pile all of your Japanese forces defense in depth in the center of the old city here. Now you do have to put some in this section over here. On this side you can see the Pasig River, which runs through the middle of the city there. On the north side of the Pasig River, and to the east of this little tributary here, you have to have some Japanese forces in there. Because if the U.S. eliminates all those forces before a certain game turn, that results in a sudden death victory for the U.S. So you can't just put everybody in a blob here in this little corner of the city, because you have to have some forces over on the side of the river. But what it doesn't force you to do is put anything out at these airfields. Now, in reading the history of the battle, there was a lot of tough Japanese resistance at Nichols Airfield out here, and then in these various outer boroughs along the bay here, and then also out here where I've got these guys in the San Juan district and what's the other district here? The New Manila district. There were also Japanese forces out there, as well as down here at Fort McKinley. So in an effort to not be totally ahistorical and just have the Japanese all turtled in the interior of the city, I tried to put some of them in their historical zones. And the forces are actually marked with historical designations. So you can see there's Japanese forces here marked NS. Those were Nichols sector forces, which would have been fighting at the Nichols airfield. So I put them in a couple of provisional forces there just for some historical flavor. And, you know, they'll probably get pretty easily brushed aside. But the game does have a really simple CRT, which is you either miss or you're killed. So it's fairly light in that regard. And there is a possibility if you roll a 1 on the die that some of these units with less than 10 firepower, like these provisional units, can actually kill an entire American unit on a lucky die roll. So, you know, there is threat there from these because the game has defensive fire, so anytime these units move adjacent to a stationary unit that's non-phasing unit, that unit will roll for defensive fire and potentially eliminate whoever's moving up next to them. So, you know, you have to approach with caution and plan your attacks accordingly. But as you can see, just on the first turn, and the movement allowance for everybody is 16, except for these white typeface Japanese units, which are fixed units that can't move. Otherwise, everybody can move 16 spaces. There's no Zocs, but there is defensive fire for units that move adjacent. So, as you can see over here, a couple of American units were eliminated on that first turn as they moved onto the map and up adjacent to various Japanese defended strong points. And then you got your various DRMs for, which are, you can't read from here, but there's a pretty lengthy list for different circumstances involving elevation and urban hexes versus building hexes. There are actual strong point building hexes listed on here. You can see City Hall and Legislature, High Commissioner's Office, etc., etc. All of those buildings offer even more substantial DRMs than just urban hexes. So there's also air support that the U.S. forces can use. They're stacked off map right now. They don't come on until turn 3 because MacArthur had, in the hopes of saving the city, had said don't do any strategic bombing or heavy artillery until ordered. And once he realized that the Japanese resistance was much stiffer than what he thought, he opened up American artillery and air support, which essentially destroyed the entire city. So there is this indirect and artillery and air fire stuff that you can do for the Americans to wipe out the Japanese. Essentially, there's no way the Japanese can win. What you're trying to do as the Japanese player would be to keep any units on the map at the end of turn 10. So if you can, and that may be one reason why you want to try and spread your Japanese forces out historically, because you could have some little pocket of Japanese forces that doesn't have enough Americans allocated to it to take them out before the end of the turn. So that's why I kind of tried to spread the forces out a little bit, you know, just to make the Americans themselves spread out. The Americans have to enter the map. The Japanese player sets all of his forces up on the map first. Then the Americans enter the map, division at a time. The 11th Airborne enters the south edge of the map, and then the Cav and 37th Infantry and 14th Corps all enter the map from the north. And the 14th Corps has to come on last. They're kind of the support corps, and they're the only division that can stack their units with units of another division. Otherwise, the other 3 American divisions cannot stack with each other. So stacking limit is 2 counters, so pretty easy to remember. Overall, it's a fairly light war game, the kind of thing you would expect from a magazine game. I've seen S&T games that are more, a little deeper than this and more complex. But this one in particular is fairly light and should be pretty quick to play, especially with that simplified CRT. But we'll see how fast it goes once I get into the artillery and airborne support combat. Just finished the 5th turn. In fact, I should move that up to turn 6 of Manila 45. As you can see, there's a nice pile of dead Japanese units there. Not so many for the Americans. The most casualties have been to the 1st Cav. For some reason they've been I don't know, targeted more, or have I think they've moved more, so there's been more defensive fire, and that's how they've ended up with more casualties. Not too much for the 37th or the 11th Airborne. Actually, the 11th Airborne had more earlier and has replenished their casualties. The American forces at the start of every turn can replace 1 dead unit per division back onto the map. So that's why there have been more American casualties than that, but they've each gotten to bring 1 back in return. So it doesn't, not quite as drastic looking as the giant pile of Japanese casualties there. As you can see, Nichols Field has been cleared. Fort McKinley's been cleared. The American Air Force is now, MacArthur has rescinded his no bombing, no artillery order, so the city is now being pounded into rubble to get the Japanese out. So the 11th Airborne has advanced through the Paranake district and the, whatever that is, Kuli district, over here to these universities, LaSalle University and something college, can't read it underneath that unit. And there's not a lot of firepower. I haven't consolidated up the rest of the 11th Airborne units, but they don't have a whole lot of firepower to bring to bear there, so I've been using it in conjunction with some of this 14th Corps and 1st Cav artillery over here, which is now moved up. I was able to cross at this bridge down here near the Pandakan district and move most of my artillery up, and now there's some more 1st Cav close assault units here, also heading up to clear out these units over by the university, and then they'll turn their firepower onto the Intramuros. You know, maybe close, halfway through the game, and there's still a lot of Japanese units to eliminate. They have to, the American forces to win have to eliminate all of them, so the Japanese can win by having even 1 unit left on the map at the end of 10 turns. So I need to, there was a real long delay here. You can see that 37th unit. Just underneath there is a rebel counter, and that's the St. Lazarus Hospital, or St. Lazaro Hospital in the Santa Cruz district. And there was 1 like Japanese military police unit there that I just could not kill, and they held up this entire several battalions of the 37th Division. Same thing here with the Bilibid prison that finally cleared out thanks to an airstrike, and now that's freed up some more of these 37th unit infantry units to move along and try and clear the rest of these Japanese units from the banks of the Pasig River, which, as you can see here, the Japanese have now blown all the bridges across the Pasig there. So the U.S. forces will have to use their bridge laying units down here to get these 37th Division units across the river once they've cleaned out the Japanese on this side. And then it'll be down just to the fortress Intramuros here, the old city, where the Japanese will make their last stand. So we'll see what it looks like after 10 turns at the end of the game, whether the Americans can pull it off or not. Alright, just finished up Manila 45, and as you can see over here on the turn track, it came down to the last turn. You know, it basically comes down to die rolls at the end. There's not, the Japanese can't even really return fire once their stacks get small enough. There's no way that they can muster enough fire in these urban hexes, which have a +1 DRM or +2, or actually +3 DRM if they're in stronghold buildings, or if the allies are in stronghold buildings, that if you've got less than 10 strength points, you need to roll a 1 to get an elimination on the CRT, which you can see over here is just either dead or alive. Those are the only possibilities. But if you've got a +2 or +3 DRM and you've got less than 10 strength points firing, you can't do any damage. So it eventually just became little isolated pockets of Japanese forces that couldn't inflict any damage on the Americans. So the turns go pretty quickly at that point, and it just becomes, will the Americans be able to eliminate every Japanese unit by turn 10? Even if the Allies can bring more than 50 firing points against a particular hex, if the Japanese are holed up in these building hexes, which most of them were at the end or behind walls or so forth, you can't. You can still miss even with the maximum firing points because so many DRMs start to stack up after a while. That's why you got to do the Americans have to use their close assault and flamethrower DRMs, which are a -2, which can eat into some of those fortress-like DRMs that the Japanese start to get for those buildings. But even with the overwhelming preponderance of American force, it comes down to the wire to try and get every last Japanese unit off the map by the end of the game. So overall, fairly quick, light magazine game. Gives you some sense of, despite how light it is, of the just brutal nature of the fighting here in urban combat in this particular battle. Because even with the overwhelming firepower of the Americans just digging out these troops, those DRMs just start to stack up after a while, especially in the fortress area like the Intramuros there. You've got walls, heavy buildings, potential rubble, which even increases further. I'm surprised there weren't more rubble markers. You can see a couple here on the map. Basically, if you take a hex, an urban hex, you make a die roll afterwards, and if you roll a 6, it's reduced to rubble. You can also choose to reduce things to rubble, which actually can kind of improve the defensive capabilities of it. I ended up not doing that with the Japanese. The only thing I ended up doing was blowing up the bridges with the Japanese, but they could have reduced their own buildings to rubble that they were in, and potentially gotten a little defensive bonus from that. So overall, I enjoyed it for what it is. It's not a serious study of the Manila fighting, more just a glimpse at. It was a tough fight, and I can see why. Even though it didn't last as long as Stalingrad or involve nearly as many troops as Stalingrad, I can see why they would call it the Stalingrad of the Pacific, because the city was just destroyed from this, and the Japanese were dug in about as deeply as they could be dug in, given the preparations that they made. I mean, it took the Americans a month to root them all out of there, and at the end they lost something like 16,000 troops killed. The Americans lost, I think, 5,000 killed, or that might have been 5,000 casualties total for the Americans. The Japanese, the losses were far worse for the Japanese because they weren't going to surrender, so they just had to literally be destroyed inside the buildings that they were holed up in. So just a brutal fight for Manila. And so interesting to me because I just didn't know anything at all about this conflict or this battle. And so it was interesting to read about it in the magazine, and then to play the game and realize that it was kind of difficult to it looks like it's going to be easy. It's like, well, what hope did the Japanese possibly have? But you miss some die rolls, and the turns start to, that end of the game starts to come up on you pretty fast. So there you have it, Manila 1945. Strategy and tactics.